Welcome to Nourish MD, Doctor-Dietitian Dialogues, where doctors and dietitians empower you about your health and discuss and provide a better path to health and wellness. Proudly presented by Concierge Medical Practice Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA, with your hosts, registered dietitians and nutritionist, Lauren Papanos and Ramona Brennan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nourish MD. I am one of your hosts, Lauren Papanos, joined by my co-host, Ramona Brennan. And today we are going to be talking all about the role of a diet and what you eat in eye health and vision. And so we want to first start off by really talking about one of the most important aspects to this conversation around how your diet influences your vision, which is around the topic of blood sugar. And we've had other podcasts where we've talked about the importance of blood sugar regulation, but you may not be familiar with the fact that it actually also impacts your eye health and how healthy your eyes are for the longest period of time. So essentially helping prevent vision loss with time. So Ramona, maybe you could just introduce us to how does blood sugar actually impact eye health over the course of our lifespan?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about blood sugar imbalances, right, what does that mean? What does blood sugar dysregulation entail? And what we're talking about when in relation to blood sugar dysregulation, not just insulin resistance, not just diabetes, right? But it's really going from these high highs, hyperglycemia, to low lows, hypoglycemia. And that blood sugar roller coaster really influences your inflammatory response and can very directly impact your eye health. Not only those high highs and those low lows is an issue, but it's also, of course, an issue if your blood sugar is constantly elevated. And that would be chronic hyperglycemia that very quickly can develop into insulin resistance. So where your insulin levels are chronically elevated because of that high blood sugar, that high blood glucose. So dysregulation can look like a couple of different things, but where we really see it be problematic is where we're talking about consistent elevations where your body, then your pancreas, right, that the role of your pancreas being to produce insulin, which is that blood sugar regulating hormone. Maybe your body's been pumping out insulin for so long, and now your cells are no longer receptive to that insulin. So your cells can no longer house that glucose or take up that glucose. And that's where we really see some problems there with elevated blood sugar, with elevated insulin levels. So that's what we're talking about in relation to blood sugar dysregulation. And of course, we can see early signs of blood sugar dysregulation through lab work, through some symptoms as well. So if you're someone who has that afternoon crash, who's feeling shaky, lightheaded, those are signs and symptoms of low blood sugar. Oftentimes that can come as a result from high blood sugar levels. Another symptom that we see quite frequently as well is individuals waking up overnight. Maybe you don't have a clear reason why you're waking up. It's not necessarily just to use the restroom, but maybe you're feeling hungry in the middle of the night. That can also be a response to that reactive hypoglycemia. So low blood sugar levels typically following high blood sugar levels. It's very common to see those types of sleep disturbances in relation to blood sugar dysregulation. I already had mentioned that we can see some of this on lab results too, and it goes beyond just your fasting glucose levels. Fasting glucose gives us one period of time. We really want to look at those longer term trends. So we might look at something like your hemoglobin A1C. If that is above 5.6, we are in that pre-diabetic range, higher than 5.8, 6, really getting into more of that diabetes range. But more optimal is going to be in that high 4.8, 4.9, up to about 5.2 or so. Oftentimes we see it teeter around 5.4, 5.5. And at that point in time, we can really get a handle on blood sugar balance. So really important to have some of those markers and just to keep track of that, in addition to fasting insulin. Fasting insulin is going to be that earliest marker of blood sugar dysregulation because we can see from much sooner standpoint, how is your body, how is your pancreas, how is your insulin response, your insulin sensitivity. So fasting insulin can be very enlightening for us, in addition to hemoglobin A1C, even beyond that fasting glucose. Now that we have a better sense of blood sugar dysregulation, some other symptoms that might indicate that now your blood sugar dysregulation is impacting your vision. Blurry vision is going to be the biggest kicker and the biggest indicator for how that's impacting your eye health. Also, if you're seeing spots or dark shapes in your vision, if you're having trouble seeing colors, vision loss entirely, that all can be related to blood sugar dysregulation as it impacts your eyes. And usually in the case of diabetes, we consider this diabetic retinopathy. So if that's something that sounds familiar, if you have diabetes, these symptoms aren't exclusive to individuals with diabetes though. And that's just because high blood sugar levels, whether you're diagnosed as a diabetic or not, those high blood sugar levels can actually damage the blood vessels within your eyes, within the retina, which is toward the back of your eyes, which is really important for vision, as you can imagine. So those blood vessels can essentially swell, pop, leak, and that can cause some of that vision loss or blurry vision, right? There are steps to it. There are stages to it. So if we can prevent it, fantastic. If we can help kind of stop it, if it is starting to happen, also really, really important. So now that we have a bit of a foundation, Lauren, why don't you go into the role of inflammation as well as oxidative stress and what role those two things play in these blood sugar related vision issues?
I think oftentimes when we're talking about blood sugar dysregulation, we think that it's just what you eat and what you do from exercise perspective. But there can also be a situation where, as you mentioned, with insulin resistance, there's high levels of inflammation that are blocking the body's ability to get that sugar out of the bloodstream and into those glucose-dependent cells and tissues that demand it. And then that's where we can see this insulin resistance type situation occur. And this can oftentimes be because of these elevated levels of inflammation and oxidative stress. Now, this is particularly problematic for the eye because the retina, which she just talked about being at the back of the eye, has a really high metabolic demand, and it depends on tiny capillaries for both oxygen and nutrients. And when there is chronic inflammation or oxidative stress, they're kind of interchangeable type terms. This can actually damage these blood vessels that help bring in these oxygen and nutrients. So it looks like your eye is becoming insulin resistant to be able to get the energy it needs to be able to function optimally, just as we know that insulin resistance can also affect like your brain functioning optimally and your fat tissue and cells functioning optimally. Same thing that can happen in your eye. And this can be because of something that's called mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondrial dysfunction can happen for a lot of reasons. We know that naturally just the aging process can cause this. We know that certain toxins in the environment that we're exposed to can cause this, certain nutrient deficiencies. If you are someone who has a history of like being an athlete and expending a lot of energy turnover through exercise, you can also be at higher risk of mitochondrial dysfunction as well. But this mitochondrial dysfunction can significantly affect the eye because the eye is so energy dependent. And this oxidative stress that occurs with this mitochondrial dysfunction actually impairs how your body produces that energy that you need for the eye. So when we think about things that cause inflammation and oxidative stress, we really want to look at is, are you first and foremost getting enough of these nutrients in your diet to be able to help combat these processes? So we're going to talk about next is, what are these specific vitamins and minerals that beyond just balancing your blood sugar through the way you pair foods together, but really getting into the actual properties, the micronutrients, the minerals, the vitamins within the foods you're eating, and how critical those are for supporting this normal inflammation and oxidative stress response so that we can have healthy energy production for the eye.
Enhance your wellness with PPMA's full script service. Our platform offers personalized supplement plans, easy online ordering, and fast delivery right to your door. Whether you're looking to boost your immune system, improve energy levels, or support overall health, FullScript has you covered. Visit privatemds.com to learn more and start your personalized plan today.
So, Ramona, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of those key vitamins and minerals that we know play a role in overall eye health and preventing issues with vision?
Yeah. First and foremost, omega-3 fatty acids. I feel like we talk about these every podcast in so many of our nutrition group sessions because those omega-3 fatty acids are so key for so many aspects of our health. And omega-3 fatty acids are considered essential fatty acids. That means we need to intake them through diet and or supplementation because our body can't produce them on its own. And so, of course, if you are someone who can eat 3 ounces of salmon every day, fantastic, in order to get what would be considered by most research sufficient omega-3s. But, if you're not able to get that, then you might want to consider supplementation in order to get both EPA as well as DHA. And DHA in particular is very important for eye health just because we have a lot of DHA in our eyeballs. It's also very important for development. There's been some very interesting research in terms of how these omega-3 fatty acids can both prevent neurodegenerative diseases and also serve as an important piece of treatment. So from brain health to eye health, these omega-3 fatty acids are really, really important. Also, antioxidants. I think some of the most common nutrients for eye health that people may be aware of include lutein, zeaxanthin. Those two are the primary antioxidants or polyphenols that we see kind of touted as these eye superfoods, if you will. While we can supplement with them, of course, these are also available in food sources. That is where they come from, right, with these plant-based compounds. And both of them are very abundant in leafy greens, dark vegetables, bell peppers, parsley, things of that sort. I think oftentimes people think about spinach as being helpful for eye health, but we really want to diversify those leafy greens as best as possible. Kale, fantastic. Even something like romaine lettuce, which a lot of people might not take into account because it has a higher water content. They might not think that it has very many benefits, but it actually does have some good amounts of lutein in it as well. Also, eggs have these in addition to, so not just those plant foods, but if you can pack your diet full of those dark leafy greens, that's only going to be beneficial. As well as vitamin C, vitamin E, and vitamin A. Most people think about vitamin A and beta carotene as being really helpful for eye health, right? Carrots, eat your carrots for your eye health. But in addition to those vitamins, we also need zinc and other minerals, but primarily zinc in order to even convert vitamin A into the substance that is really important for vision health. So a lot of these nutrients, these vitamins, these minerals, these antioxidants, they work very synergistically. We don't just want to focus on one, but if we can diversify our diet and get a wide variety of these micronutrients in that diet, right, we're only going to be helping the absorption of each of those nutrients, the conversion, right? Maybe you're someone who needs to up those minerals through specific supplementation or use something like a mineral complex if you find it hard to diversify your diet accordingly. But again, lutein, zeaxanthin, vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, zinc, these are all so important in addition to those fatty acids, of course. So those are just a handful, but you can find them again in supplementation and widespread throughout food sources in addition. So Lauren, kind of circling back to insulin resistance, other metabolic conditions, why don't we touch on a little bit more detail in terms of how do metabolic conditions contribute to eye diseases like diabetic retinopathy, which we were talking about, but also things like glaucoma, cataracts, conditions such as those.
So it all goes back to what we touched on earlier, which is this relationship between blood sugar regulation and this inflammation / oxidative stress / mitochondrial dysfunction piece. And I say slash because all of those are really like one and the same and that they're so interconnected with each other. And we know that with each of those conditions, diabetic retinopathy, glaucoma, cataracts, that diabetes and blood sugar control play a significant role in the progression of these diseases. And it doesn't even have to be full-fledged diabetes, even just insulin resistance, which we know insulin resistance often is brewing for about 8 to 10 years before diabetes even occurs. So you could be in the early stages of blood sugar dysregulation, starting to see some elevations and abnormalities within things like A1C, or even just starting to feel some of those symptoms that you had mentioned earlier, but maybe not actually a diagnosis of diabetes yet, because we're dealing with what we call this insulin resistance piece, which unfortunately insulin's not a very commonly tested hormone. And that can be why it kind of flies under the radar for such a long period of time. But those, both diabetes and insulin resistance, kind of that early stage diabetes, play a significant role in these. And then also what we call like metabolic dysfunction, which just means that our metabolism, which is how we burn the food that we eat into usable energy for our cells, is dysfunctioning. There's some hiccups happening along the way, and these processes aren't functioning as optimally as they should be. Maybe it's because there's certain vitamins and minerals that are lacking within the diet, and these vitamins and minerals are what string along this process to ensure that the food that we eat gets converted well into usable energy. Or maybe it's that we have this chronic inflammation that we talked about earlier that's blocking all of that energy from that food we eat from being able to really get into those cells that need it most, one of those being our eyes. But we know that with these situations of high blood sugar, which, as you mentioned earlier, can be a result of even low blood sugar. So it's not necessarily that we're always eating too much carbohydrate or eating too much sugar. Sometimes it can be that we're getting into these low blood sugar environments because maybe we're going too long in between meals, or maybe we are not pairing foods together properly. And that when those situations happen, our body releases glucocorticoids like cortisol, which release sugar, and that's what causes this high blood sugar environment. But whatever the cause of the high blood sugar, we know that one of the things that high blood sugar does is that it promotes a process called glycation. And what happens with glycation is that these sugar molecules attach to proteins and lipids, which are fats, and they produce something that are called AGEs, which you might have heard of before. Those are a big component to the acceleration of the aging process. And so we know that when these AGEs are formed, that's when inflammation and oxidative stress become triggered. And then that can then accelerate these conditions such as retinopathy, cataracts, and even macular degeneration. So we really want to focus on is not just how do we keep our body out of these high and low blood sugar situations and try to keep a very stable blood sugar response. Think of it less as a roller coaster and more so as like these rolling hills that we're looking for after each time you eat and throughout the middle of the day in between meals. That's what we're looking for with your blood sugar control. And secondly, how do we make sure that you have enough of those vitamins and minerals like the ones you mentioned, as well as things that help to be able to support our inflammation processes so that we can ensure that with that healthy blood sugar response, that sugar that we are consuming, that it is getting into places like our eyes that need it the most. So thank you guys so much for tuning in today to our episode on blood sugar and vision. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. We'll see you then.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Nourish MD, Doctor Dietitian Dialogues. This podcast is intended for general educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any nutrition or supplement recommendations. Sign up for our mailing list so you'll never miss an episode of our wellness journey. See the podcast description for the link.